He must have forgotten he was standing in my house. I did not yell back. I did not beg. I simply smiled. A cold, hard smile stood up from the table, walked to the front door, and did something that shocked everyone in that room. My name is Victor Thorne. I am 70 years old, and before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your worth. Tell me what time it is in your city right now. It brings me great joy to know where my listeners are tuning in from. Now let me tell you how a proud father, a man who spent his entire life building a legacy, became an outcast in his own home, and how I taught them a lesson they will never ever forget. It was Christmas Eve. Outside, a heavy snow was falling over Chevy Chase, Maryland, blanketing the manicured lawns and grand estates in a quiet, freezing white. Inside my home, the fireplaces were crackling, and the scent of roasted turkey, rosemary, and expensive wine drifted through the air. It was a picturesque holiday scene, the kind they print on luxury greeting cards. But beneath that flawless surface, the foundation of my family was completely rotten. I had spent my entire career as a structural engineer. For 40 years, I evaluated the integrity of massive steel beams, the load-bearing capacity of concrete pillars, and the unseen stress points that could cause a towering building to collapse. I was trained to spot disaster long before it happened. Yet when it came to my own family, I had been completely blind to the cracks. I stood in front of the mirror in my downstairs bedroom, adjusting the dark burgundy silk tie that my late wife Diane had bought me for our 30th anniversary. Diane passed away 2 years ago. When she died, she took the warmth of this house with her. We had bought this sprawling $2.5 million estate 30 years ago. I had paid off the mortgage a decade ahead of schedule, with sweat, long hours, and endless sacrifices. It was my castle. It was supposed to be the sanctuary where I lived out my final days in absolute peace. I smoothed down the lapels of my finest charcoal suit, took a deep breath, and walked out of my room, heading toward the main dining area to join my family for the holiday dinner. As I crossed the threshold into the grand dining room, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, sitting in the center of the room, was the massive oak table Diane and I had commissioned from a local craftsman all those years ago. It was a beautiful, heavy piece of woodwork, strong and unyielding. But as I looked at the table setting, a cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The table was elaborately decorated. Silver candelabras, fresh pine centerpieces, and expensive porcelain plates were arranged with absolute precision. But I immediately noticed the count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 plates. 8 perfectly folded linen napkins. 8 crystal wine glasses catching the light from the overhead chandelier. I looked around the room. My son-in-law, Derek Mitchell, 34 years old and wearing a tailored suit that cost more than a reliable used car, was pouring champagne. My daughter, Rachel, 32 years old, the only child Diane and I ever had, was nervously arranging the silverware. Derek's parents were seated on the far side of the table, sipping their drinks with an air of unearned superiority. And then there were the guests. 4 men I had never seen before in my life. They wore sharp, expensive suits, their hair slicked back, their eyes cold and calculating. They did not look like friends. They looked like predators. I counted again. Derek, Rachel, Derek's parents, and the 4 strangers. That made 8 people. There were 8 chairs pulled up to the table. There was no place setting for me. There was no chair for me. I stood there in the doorway, staring at the polished oak wood, feeling a profound sense of isolation wash over me. How did I become a ghost in my own house? I remembered the long nights I spent drafting blueprints, the weekends I sacrificed missing my daughter's school plays just so I could put enough money away to secure her future. I remembered signing the final check that paid this house off in full. I had given Rachel everything. And when Derek came into the picture with his smooth talk and his supposedly brilliant startup company, I welcomed him with open arms. When Diane passed away, the house had felt painfully empty. Rachel and Derek had approached me with a seemingly loving proposal. They asked to move in. They said they wanted to take care of me in my old age, to make sure I wasn't lonely all while they saved up capital for Derek's expanding business. I was grieving, vulnerable, and desperate for family connection. So I said yes. I had let the Trojan horse through my front gates. Over the last 8 months, I had been slowly and methodically pushed to the margins of my own life. It started with small requests, tiny compromises that I agreed to for the sake of peace. They took over my library. They moved me into the basement. But standing in this dining room looking at a table where I had literally been erased from the guest list on Christmas Eve, the brutal reality finally shattered my denial. I was not a respected elder in this house. I was an inconvenience. I felt the anger rising in my chest, a hot, blinding fury. But my engineering mind took over. Anger makes you reckless. Calmness makes you dangerous. I did not yell. I did not ask why I was excluded. Instead, I turned on my heel, walked quietly down the hall to my private study, and grabbed my heavy leather-backed reading chair. I gripped the armrests tightly and dragged it out of the study and straight down the hallway. The heavy wooden legs scraped against the pristine hardwood floors, letting out a loud, grating screech that echoed through the entire house. The polite, superficial chatter in the dining room instantly died. I dragged the chair right to the head of the table, the very spot where I had sat for 30 years. I wedged it roughly between Derek and one of his slick-suited guests. I walked over to the antique buffet cabinet, grabbed a spare ceramic plate and a silver fork, and set them down in front of me. Then I sat down. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every single person in the room, my face completely devoid of emotion. The silence was absolute. It was thick enough to choke on. The 4 strangers exchanged confused, irritated glances. Derek's parents looked at me with open disgust as if a vagrant had just wandered in off the street and crashed their royal banquet. And Rachel, my daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders and protected from the harshness of the world. She looked down at her lap, her face flushed with embarrassment, completely avoiding my eyes. She was too cowardly to defend the father who had given her the very ground she was standing on. Derek's face turned a violent shade of crimson. The vein in his neck throbbed against his stiff white collar. He stood up so fast his chair slammed against the wall behind him. He slammed his fist onto the oak table. The silverware jumped, and the crystal glasses clinked sharply against each other. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Derek hissed, leaning over the table, his eyes filled with venom and rage. "Go away! You are not invited to this dinner!" He was shouting at me. In the house that I owned, over the table that I bought. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked at his red, furious face and I smiled. It was a slow, calculating smile that made the anger in his eyes flicker into sudden hesitation. I calmly placed my silver fork down on my empty plate. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my charcoal suit. "Enjoy your dinner, Derek," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the front foyer. I could hear Derek scoffing behind me, muttering to his guests about his crazy senile father-in-law. They all thought I was retreating. They thought I had been defeated, humiliated, and broken. They thought I was walking out into the freezing snow to hide my shame. But as my hand wrapped firmly around the cold brass doorknob, a quiet sense of triumph settled over me. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. Because I wasn't leaving. I was opening the door for the people waiting on the other side. To understand how I found myself standing at my own front door, you have to go back 8 months to the exact moment it started. You have to go back to the exact moment my world was ripped apart, and my judgment was compromised by a grief so heavy it felt like breathing underwater. Diane passed away in early April. The cancer was aggressive, unapologetic, and fast. 1 month she was planting hydrangeas in the backyard, her hands covered in potting soil, laughing at a joke I made from the patio. 2 months later, I was standing in a black suit, watching a wooden casket being lowered into the damp ground. Without her, the $2.5 million estate felt like a massive, empty mausoleum. I am a man of logic and mathematics. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer. I knew the precise limits of concrete and steel, and I spent my life making sure the structures I worked on could weather any storm. People trusted me to keep their buildings standing tall and secure. Yet when it came to my own life, the sudden removal of my load-bearing pillar left me entirely unstable. I was a 70-year-old man, wandering echoing hallways, eating dinner in silence and sleeping on only one side of a king-sized bed. I was vulnerable, and a vulnerable man is always an easy target. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, barely 3 weeks after Diane's funeral, when Rachel and Derek came over. We sat in the living room. Rachel looked around, her eyes lingering on the empty spaces where her mother's presence used to be so commanding. Derek sat beside her, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He had that earnest expression he always wore when he was about to make a pitch. "Dad, we have been talking." Rachel began, her voice soft and trembling with a concern. "We hate seeing you here all by yourself. Mom wouldn't want you to be alone in this massive house. It is too much for one person." I sighed, looking down at my coffee cup. "I am managing Rachel. It is just quiet, that is all." Derek gently placed his hand over Rachel's painting, a perfect picture of the supportive, caring husband. "Victor, we want to help. My tech startup is entering a crucial expansion phase right now. We are looking to scale our operations, which means we need to redirect a significant portion of our personal capital into the business for the next year or two. At the same time, we have been deeply worried about your physical and mental well-being. The isolation here is simply not good for you. We were thinking of giving up the lease on our apartment downtown. We want to move in here with you. It is a win-win situation. We can save the capital I need for my company's expansion, and more importantly, we can be here to properly take care of you." It was the plausible lie. It sounded so reasonable, so compassionate. They were offering to sacrifice their independence to care for a grieving widower, while practically asking for my blessing to build their future. I should have seen the hidden cracks. I should have applied the same rigorous scrutiny to Derek's proposal that I applied to my architectural blueprints. But I was blinded by a desperate, agonizing need for family. Rachel was the only living piece of Diane I had left. I wanted to hear footsteps on the wooden stairs again. I wanted to smell food cooking in the kitchen. I wanted the comforting illusion of a whole family. So I ignored the fundamental flaws in Derek's character. I ignored the subtle, disturbing way Rachel always seemed to shrink into herself whenever Derek took control of a conversation. I wanted to believe the best in my daughter, and by extension, the man she actively chose to marry. "You are welcome to stay," I told them, my voice thick with heavy emotion. "This house is big enough for all of us. You do not need to worry about rent or utility bills. Just focus on your business, Derek, and Rachel just be here with me." They moved their belongings into my home exactly 3 days later. The invasion began almost immediately, carefully disguised under the bright banner of domestic helpfulness. Boxes were brought in, furniture was rapidly rearranged, and the quiet, steady rhythm of my life was suddenly dictated by Derek's erratic schedule. He was a little too eager, directing the professional moving men with the loud authority of a newly crowned king taking absolute possession of a conquered territory. But I pushed the negative feeling down deep inside. I told myself it was just a natural adjustment period. I told myself I was being a stubborn, set-in-his-ways old man who simply needed to learn how to share his space again. But the comforting illusion of a harmonious family arrangement did not even last a full 24 hours. It was their very first night sleeping in the house. I had gone out for my usual evening walk around the quiet neighborhood, a strict routine I maintained to keep my joints active and my mind reasonably clear. The crisp night air felt surprisingly good on my face. It gave me a brief moment of hope. I thought about the breakfast we would all share the next morning. I thought about having people to talk to over the morning paper. I returned to the house just after 9 o'clock. I walked up the paved driveway, stepped onto the front porch, and pulled my brass keys from my coat pocket. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the foyer. The house was extremely quiet. I reached for the security panel on the wall, just as I had done every single night for the past 15 years. I pressed my 4-digit code to disarm the system. The keypad flashed a harsh, bright red. A sharp electronic beep echoed loudly through the hallway. Error. Invalid code. I frowned. My fingers were old, but my memory was incredibly sharp. I carefully typed the code again. Red flash. Sharp beep. Invalid code. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable flutter in my chest. The alarm system had never failed before. I tried a third time, pressing the numbers deliberately. The system immediately locked me out, and a loud, piercing warning tone began to sound, indicating that the police would be dispatched in 60 seconds. Suddenly, Derek appeared at the top of the sweeping wooden staircase. He was wearing silk pajamas, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking entirely too relaxed. "Derek," I called out over the blaring alarm. "The security panel is malfunctioning. My code is not working." He walked down the stairs slowly, a casual, untroubled smile on his face. He did not look like a guest who had just moved in. He looked like an owner dealing with a confused tenant. He walked past me, reached over to the panel, and typed in a completely new set of numbers. The alarm immediately fell silent. The green light flipped back on. I stared at the panel, then at him. "What did you just do? Why didn't my code work?" Derek took a sip of his water, his eyes meeting mine with an infuriating calmness. "Oh, my apologies, Victor. I forgot to mention it. The system had a weird security glitch this afternoon while you were out. It was acting up and driving Rachel crazy. I went ahead and completely reset the master code to fix the problem. I figured it was just easier to synchronize it with the code we used at our old apartment." He smiled again, a perfectly practiced, plausible smile. "I will write the new numbers down for you in the morning," he added lightly, turning his back on me and heading toward the kitchen. "Have a good night, Victor." I stood alone in the dimly lit foyer, staring at the green light on the wall. A security glitch. It was such a small, reasonable explanation. But my gut twisted violently. You do not change the master security code of another man's house on your first night living there unless you are sending a message. He had locked me out of my own system, and he had done it right to my face. I stood there paralyzed by his audacity, realizing I had made a terrible mistake. I had invited a parasite into my sanctuary. The man my daughter married didn't see me as a grieving father who needed companionship. He saw me as a naive, helpless obstacle standing in the way of his ambitions. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold air. The blinking green light on the security panel felt like a mockery. I stood in the silent foyer for a long time after Derek walked away. I told myself to be incredibly patient. I told myself that Derek was just an arrogant, overeager young man who lacked basic manners and proper boundaries. I tried to convince myself that Rachel would eventually step in. But the sturdy foundation of my life in this house had already begun to shift in ways I could no longer ignore. Over the next few weeks, the subtle microaggressions quickly evolved into a calculated, agonizing takeover. It was a masterclass in slow eviction. Derek did not conquer the house with shouting or physical force. He took it over like toxic black mold spreading behind the drywall, silent and insidious, until the rot was everywhere. The first true casualty of this silent war was my beloved library. For over 3 decades, that specific room had been my ultimate sanctuary. It was a grand space lined from the floor to the vaulted ceiling with dark custom walnut bookshelves. Those shelves held hundreds of architectural volumes, structural engineering manuals, and original blueprints from buildings I spent my life designing. On the walls hung my framed degrees, engineering licenses, and the lifetime achievement awards I earned through grueling dedication to my craft. Diane used to sit in the plush leather armchair by the large bay window, quietly reading her romance novels while I drafted technical designs at my heavy oak desk. One Tuesday afternoon, I returned home from picking up groceries at the local market. The house was uncharacteristically loud. I walked down the main hallway toward the kitchen to put away the fresh produce. As I passed the library, I abruptly stopped. The heavy wooden double doors were propped wide open. Inside, 2 men wearing gray work uniforms were efficiently dismantling my life. My solid oak desk had been shoved unceremoniously into the far corner of the room. In its place stood a sleek, sterile glass table equipped with dual monitors and a massive tangle of black cables. My heart hammered in my chest. I dropped the grocery bags on the hardwood floor and stepped cautiously into the room. There, stacked haphazardly against the beautifully painted wall, were a dozen cheap cardboard moving boxes. Sticking out of the top of one crushed box was the delicate glass plaque I had received for designing the city central bridge. It was horribly chipped on the top corner. Derek was standing directly by the window, speaking loudly into his mobile phone, aggressively waving his hands with that fake energetic charisma he always used for his business calls. He saw me standing frozen in the doorway, held up a single index finger to dismissively shush me, and casually finished his conversation. When he finally hung up the phone, he turned to face me with a bright, entirely artificial smile. "Victor, good you are finally home," Derek said cheerfully, completely ignoring the absolute shock written all over my face. "I hope you do not mind the sudden mess. My startup is entering a massive hyper-growth phase right now, and I absolutely needed a proper dedicated headquarters. The investors need to see a highly professional background when we do our video conferences. A dedicated corporate workspace is crucial right now for our branding." I stared blankly at the cardboard boxes holding 40 years of my professional legacy. "You boxed up my engineering awards. You took down my framed blueprints without asking me. This is my private library, Derek." He let out a short, highly dismissive sigh, clearly annoyed that I was not eagerly cooperating with his grand vision. "Victor, let us be practical here for a minute. You are a retired man. You do not draft blueprints anymore. You just sit in here and read old books. The company desperately needs this space to generate actual revenue for our future. We are a family now, and family requires practical compromises to succeed." He walked right past me, patting my shoulder patronizingly as he headed toward the kitchen. I felt my hands balling into tight, shaking fists. The sheer disrespect was staggering. I immediately sought out Rachel. I found her hiding in the sunroom, curled up tightly on the floral sofa, scrolling aimlessly on her tablet. I stood firmly before her, struggling intensely to keep my voice steady. "Rachel, your husband just packed my entire library into cheap cardboard boxes. He completely took over my space without even having the basic decency to ask for my permission. You need to talk to him right now. This behavior is absolutely unacceptable." Rachel did not look up right away. When she finally raised her eyes to meet mine, I saw the carefully rehearsed expression already waiting for me. It was the plausible lie heavily coated in a thick, suffocating layer of fake filial concern. "Dad, please do not be difficult about this situation," she said softly, adopting a soothing tone one might use to placate a confused, irrational toddler. "Derek is under an enormous amount of stress right now with the business launch. He really needs a quiet, professional place to work without any distractions. He can easily work in the spare guest bedroom upstairs." I argued, my frustration mounting rapidly. "The library is my private space. It holds my entire career." Rachel stood up slowly, placing her warm hands gently on my arms. "Dad, we actually wanted to talk to you about the bedrooms anyway. Derek and I have been discussing your current living situation. We noticed you have been struggling a lot lately. Your knees are getting really bad. I saw you wincing when you walked up the main stairs last week." My knees were perfectly fine. I walked 2 miles every single evening without a single complaint or ache. I stared at my daughter silently, waiting for the trap to spring shut. "We strongly think it is best if you move down into the basement guest suite," Rachel continued smoothly, her eyes wide with manufactured theatrical worry. "There are absolutely no stairs to climb from the garage entrance. It is completely safe. It has its own little private bathroom. You will have so much more privacy down there, away from all of Derek's loud business meetings. It is just safer for you, Dad. We worry so much about you falling and getting seriously hurt while we are busy working." The betrayal hit me like a heavy physical blow to the chest. She was weaponizing my age against me. She was framing my forced eviction from the main floors of my own home as an act of pure loving care. The basement guest suite was essentially a glorified storage area. It had a single small, high window that barely let in any natural sunlight. It was constantly damp, uncomfortably cold, and entirely isolated from the rest of the living spaces. "You want to put me in the basement," I stated flatly. The bitter words tasted like dry ash in my mouth. "It is a private suite, Dad," she corrected quickly, stepping back as if my flat tone genuinely frightened her. "It is for your own good. We just want you to be comfortable and secure. Please do not make this harder than it has to be." I looked deeply at my daughter, the little girl I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle in our driveway. The young woman whose expensive college tuition I had paid in full without hesitation. She was standing in the very house I bought with my blood and sweat, politely telling me to descend into the cold earth so her arrogant husband could play businessman in my sanctuary. I did not argue. Arguing with a committed liar only gives them the opportunity to invent more lies. I simply turned around, walked away, and began the agonizing, heartbreaking process of packing my clothes. Moving my life into the basement took 3 long, exhausting days. Every single trip down those creaky wooden stairs felt like a literal descent into permanent exile. I carefully arranged my clothes in the small, musty closet. I set up a small reading lamp next to the modest, firm bed. The silence down there was profoundly oppressive. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of being entirely forgotten by the world above. I could easily hear their footsteps moving briskly across the hardwood floors above my head, a constant mocking reminder of the vibrant life that was continuing without me. I desperately tried to find some small solace in the fact that I was helping my daughter. I repeated her words in my head over and over again. She said it was strictly for my safety. She said they cared about my well-being. I desperately wanted to believe the plausible lie. I wanted to fiercely cling to the illusion that this was a temporary, necessary sacrifice for the sake of lasting family harmony. But that fragile illusion was violently shattered late that very same night. It was well past midnight. I was lying rigidly in the basement bed, staring blankly up at the low ceiling, listening to the rhythmic droning hum of the basement furnace. The grand house above was completely dark and still. Suddenly, a heavy scraping, dragging sound reverberated loudly through the floorboards. It was coming directly from the master bedroom, the beautiful room that had been mine and Diane's for 30 years. The sudden sound was loud, rough, and unmistakable. It was the awful sound of heavy wooden furniture being scraped aggressively across the polished hardwood floors. I immediately threw off the thin covers, my heart racing with panic. I slipped on my walking shoes and quietly crept up the dark basement stairs. I carefully cracked the door open just enough to see clearly into the main hallway. The heavy front door was propped wide open, letting in a biting gust of freezing wind. Derek was struggling to physically push a large, extremely heavy piece of furniture out the front door, awkwardly maneuvering it toward the edge of the paved driveway, where a massive rented dumpster had been parked earlier that afternoon. The pale moonlight caught the intricate hand-carved floral patterns on the dark wood. It was Diane's antique vanity. It was the beautiful vanity where my wife had sat every single morning to brush her hair. It was the vanity she had deeply cherished, a priceless family heirloom passed down from her beloved grandmother. I had specifically asked Rachel to keep it totally safe in the master bedroom because it held so much profound, sentimental value to me. Derek shoved the vanity hard with his shoulder. It tipped violently over the edge of the porch, crashing violently down the concrete front steps. I distinctly heard the sickening sharp sound of the antique wood splintering and cracking upon heavy impact with the frozen driveway. He dragged the broken, shattered pieces across the wet pavement and casually heaved them into the rusted metal dumpster. He wiped his hands on his expensive pants, pulled out his phone and typed a quick message, completely unbothered by the sheer fact that he had just callously destroyed a priceless piece of my late wife's history. I stood frozen in the dark shadows of the stairwell, my breath completely catching in my dry throat. This was not about making practical space. This was not about my bad knees or my physical safety. This was a systematic, deliberate, and cruel eradication of my existence from this property. They were not just quietly taking over my house. They were throwing my entire life into the trash. The morning after the vanity was destroyed, I did not confront Derek. I sat quietly at the small table in my basement suite sipping black coffee and applied the logic of a structural engineer to my life. A massive concrete foundation never cracks without immense pressure. Buildings do not simply collapse overnight. There are always microscopic stress fractures. Derek was applying immense pressure to my life, systematically isolating me and erasing my presence from the main floors. What was the structural motive? The sheer aggression behind throwing Diane's antique vanity into a rusted dumpster spoke of a man who felt absolute ownership. He was acting like a man who had already claimed the property as his own. I needed to find the hidden stress point. I needed to understand what was fundamentally driving his arrogant behavior. So I stopped being a grieving, accommodating father and became a silent, meticulous observer in my own home. I watched Derek closely over the next 2 weeks, looking for any irregular patterns in his daily routine. Soon, a glaring anomaly presented itself. Derek claimed to be running a successful technology startup. He spent hours locked inside my former library, speaking loudly on conference calls. Yet for a man entirely focused on the digital future, he had developed a strange, obsessive fixation with the physical mail. Our postal worker Thomas usually arrived around 11 in the morning. For 15 years, the mail would simply drop through the brass slot in the front door. But now Derek was intercepting it. Every morning, precisely at 10:50, Derek walked out to the front porch with a coffee. He waited there until Thomas arrived. Derek took the stack of envelopes directly from Thomas's hands, smiled, exchanged brief words, and immediately retreated inside. He then locked himself in the library for an hour. When the sorted mail made its way to the kitchen counter for Rachel and me to review it, consisted entirely of grocery store flyers, local restaurant coupons, and utility bills. There was never anything of substance. Why was a supposedly wealthy, successful technology entrepreneur waiting for the postal worker like a starving dog, waiting for a scrap of meat every single day without fail? What was coming through the physical mail that he absolutely had to intercept before anyone else living in the house could finally open and see it? The opportunity to find out arrived on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. Rachel and Derek announced they were heading into downtown Washington for a lunch meeting with potential new investors. They dressed in their finest clothes, kissed me on the cheek with fake warmth, and drove away in their polished car. As soon as their taillights vanished down the street, I moved. I walked up the basement stairs and headed straight for the attached garage. I bypassed the standard trash cans and moved directly to the large blue recycling bin tucked away in the corner. Derek was meticulous about his image, but arrogant men often become sloppy when they believe no one is watching them. He had purchased a heavy-duty paper shredder for his new office to protect sensitive corporate documents, but he emptied the shredded plastic bin directly into our unlined household recycling container. I lifted the heavy blue lid. Inside was a mountain of white paper strips, a chaotic, tangled mess of destroyed information. I plunged my hands into the freezing bin, scooping up large handfuls of the shredded documents and dumped them into a large plastic garbage bag. I carried the bag back down the stairs into the damp isolation of my basement suite. I emptied the pile of white strips onto my bed and turned on my reading lamp. It looked like an impossible puzzle. Thousands of jagged pieces of paper completely mixed together. But I had spent 4 decades solving incredibly complex structural equations for towering skyscrapers and bridges. I had the absolute patience of a desperate man who knew his ultimate survival depended entirely on finding the absolute, undeniable truth. I began sorting the strips by color and texture. Most of the paper was standard cheap printer material, likely discarded drafts of his meaningless business proposals. But after 30 minutes of meticulous digging, my fingers brushed against a different type of paper. It was thicker, heavier, and had a very distinct glossy finish. It was high-quality corporate stationery. I gathered all the thick, glossy strips and pushed the rest of the pile onto the floor. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my back aching from the damp cold, and began piecing the jagged fragments together. It was a painstaking, frustrating process. I matched a curved letter here, a straight blue line there. After an hour, I managed to assemble the top left corner of the document. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The assembled pieces revealed the bright, unmistakable corporate logo of the largest national bank in the country. It was the exact same bank where Diane and I had held our joint checking accounts for over 30 years. It was the bank that held the original long-retired mortgage documents for this very house. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I grabbed a roll of clear adhesive tape from my nightstand and worked faster, my fingers moving with a desperate, frantic precision. I found a strip containing a date. It was dated just 4 days ago. Then I found the most crucial piece of the puzzle. It was a long strip that contained the official recipient address block. I taped it down carefully. The name printed in bold black ink was not Derek Mitchell. It was not Rachel Thorne. The letter was explicitly addressed to me, Victor Thorne. Derek was intentionally intercepting my personal financial mail, shredding it in his office, and hiding the evidence in the garage. The audacity of the crime made my blood run cold. I had not received any correspondence from that specific branch of the bank in years, not since I received the final letter confirming that my house was paid off in full. I scoured the bedspread for the remaining glossy pieces, piecing together the main body of the letter. The text was broken, missing several key words where the shredder blades had destroyed the paper entirely, but there was enough context to understand the horrific reality of my situation. I taped down a sentence fragment that read, "Equity line." I found another that read, "Appraised property value." Finally, I located the center paragraph and smoothed the clear tape over the jagged edges. I read the reconstructed sentence out loud, in the silence of my basement prison, the words echoing like a definitive death sentence. "Congratulations, Victor. You have been fully approved for your requested home equity line of credit in the amount of $1.5 million. I sat perfectly still on my bed, staring at the taped paper until my vision blurred. I had not applied for a loan. I had not requested a single dime from any financial institution, but my name was on the approval notice. I sat in the dim light of the basement, my breathing shallow and tight. The foundation of my life had not just cracked. It had been completely rigged with hidden explosives. A line of credit for $1.5 million. It was an unfathomable sum of money drawn entirely against the equity of a house I owned outright. To execute a financial maneuver of that magnitude required systemic fraud. It required forged signatures and identity verification. Derek was not merely an arrogant house guest. He was an active predator using my own daughter as his willing accomplice. I carefully gathered the taped pieces of the bank letter, folded them into a small pouch, and hid them beneath the insoles of my winter boots. If he was bold enough to forge my signature for a massive loan, what else had he already taken from me? My mind raced through a frantic inventory of my remaining physical assets. My pension accounts were secure. My vehicles were paid off. But there was something else. Something far more valuable than cash. I waited until the next morning. Derek announced he had a networking lunch downtown and would be gone for several hours. Rachel was in the kitchen, casually scrolling through her phone. I told her I was going upstairs to the den to look for an old tax document. The den was on the second floor, a small room that Derek had thankfully deemed too cramped for his corporate ambitions. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked over to a framed landscape painting hanging on the far wall. I swung the wooden frame outward on its hidden hinges, revealing the digital keypad of my personal wall safe. I punched in the 6-digit code. The heavy steel door clicked and popped open. I pulled out my passport, emergency cash, and old insurance policies. Everything seemed perfectly intact. Then I reached into the very back of the compartment to pull out the small, dark blue velvet box. I felt a cold chill run down my spine before I even flipped the lid open. The box was far too light. I pressed the golden clasp and the lid sprang back. The velvet interior was completely empty. Diane had a 2-carat diamond anniversary necklace that was gone. It was a flawless pendant I saved up for 3 years to buy for our 30th wedding anniversary. She wore it every single day. I had placed it in this safe the afternoon she passed away, unable to bear the sight of it sitting on her empty dresser. The financial value was easily worth $30,000, but the sentimental value was absolutely immeasurable. It was the physical embodiment of my devotion to my wife. And now it was stolen. I gripped the empty blue box so hard my knuckles turned white. My hands were shaking from a blinding, ferocious rage. I left the safe open and marched straight down the hallway and down the grand staircase. My heavy footsteps echoed loudly against the hardwood. I walked directly into the kitchen. Rachel was pouring a cup of coffee, humming softly. I slammed the empty velvet box down onto the granite countertop. The sharp crack made her jump. Hot coffee spilled over the rim of her mug and splashed onto her pristine white sweater. She gasped, spinning around to face me. "Dad, what is wrong with you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where is your mother diamond necklace, Rachel?" I asked, my voice dangerously low and steady. Rachel froze. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking completely pale and sickly. Her eyes darted wildly around the kitchen, looking anywhere but directly at me. "I do not know what you are talking about," she stammered, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "The safe upstairs was locked." I continued, taking a slow step closer to her. "The only people who know the combination to that specific safe are me, your late mother, and you. I checked it just now. The box is empty. Where is the necklace?" Small beads of sweat formed on her forehead. She backed away, gripping the edge of the kitchen island. "Dad, I swear I have not touched it. You must have moved it somewhere else. Do not lie to me in my own house." I warned her, the absolute fury finally breaking through my composed exterior. "That necklace has not moved from that safe in 2 years." Before she could formulate another pathetic excuse, the heavy oak front door swung open. Derek strolled into the kitchen, taking off his expensive wool coat. He immediately sensed the high tension in the room. His eyes flicked from my furious face to the empty velvet box on the counter, and then to his terrified wife. He did not look surprised. He looked annoyed. "What is going on here?" Derek asked, stepping smoothly between me and Rachel. He crossed his arms over his chest, taking a dominant, aggressive stance. "The diamond anniversary necklace I gave Diane is missing from my personal wall safe," I told him, refusing to back down. "And Rachel is the only other person alive who has the access code." Derek let out a long, exaggerated sigh. He uncrossed his arms and gave me a look of deep, patronizing pity. It was a performance worthy of a stage actor. "Come on, old man," Derek said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Listen to yourself right now. You are aggressively accusing your own daughter of being a common thief over a piece of jewelry you probably misplaced yourself." "I did not misplace anything," I said firmly. Derek stepped closer to me, lowering his voice into a soothing, incredibly insulting register. "Victor, let us be completely honest here. The stress of living alone in this big house, the grief over losing Diane, it has been terribly hard on you. Your memory is clearly failing. You have been slipping lately. Do you not remember our conversation last month? You told me you were worried about keeping such valuable items in a simple wall safe. You said you moved the diamond necklace down to your safety deposit box at the downtown bank branch for better security." I stared at him, feeling the absolute audacity of his lie wash over me. He was actively trying to rewrite my own reality. He was orchestrating a massive campaign of psychological manipulation, hoping to make me doubt my own mind. He wanted to lay the groundwork for declaring me mentally incompetent, just as I had suspected. I looked at Rachel. She was completely silent, refusing to meet my gaze, quietly allowing her husband to paint me as a senile, confused old fool. I realized in that exact moment that fighting them right now is tactically disastrous. If I pushed back, if I screamed and called the police, they would use my emotional outburst as documented proof of my supposed mental instability. They would speed up their timeline for whatever vicious plan they were executing. I needed to swallow my pride. I needed to play the exact role they had written for me. I let my shoulders slump heavily in defeat. "I suppose my mind is playing tricks," I whispered. I walked away, catching Derek in the mirror, smirking triumphantly at Rachel. I walked down the basement stairs, counting each step, focusing on the physical sensation of the wood beneath my shoes to keep my mind completely grounded. The cruel smirk I saw in the hallway mirror was etched into my brain. It was the absolute confirmation I needed. Derek was not just stealing from me. He was actively constructing a narrative of my mental decline. If a frail 70-year-old man starts claiming his jewelry is being stolen, and his daughter and own son-in-law insist he merely lost it due to failing memory, society will always believe the younger generation. It was a terrifyingly brilliant, flawless strategy. I sat alone on my basement bed and let the cold reality settle over me. I was trapped in a psychological cage match with a man who had no moral boundaries, and my own daughter was his silent accomplice. I knew I could not confront them directly again. I had to become a ghost. I had to become the exact pathetic, frail old man they desperately wanted me to be, while maintaining the sharp, analytical mind of a master engineer in the shadows. 2 days passed in a tense, manufactured peace. I played my role perfectly. I asked Rachel the same mundane questions twice in 1 hour. I intentionally misplaced my reading glasses in the kitchen and acted profoundly confused when Derek dramatically found them for me in the living room. Every time I played the fool, I saw that familiar sickening satisfaction wash over Derek's face. He was arrogant, and arrogance breeds careless mistakes. On Thursday afternoon, the weather was exceptionally clear and brisk. I put on my heavy wool coat and my walking shoes. I walked up to the kitchen where Rachel was preparing a late lunch, and Derek was furiously typing on his laptop at the kitchen island. I announced in a weak, slightly shaky voice that I was going for a long walk around the neighborhood to clear my cloudy head. Rachel barely looked up from her chopping board, offering a dismissive nod. Derek did not even acknowledge my presence. I walked out the front door, making sure to close it with a loud, definitive thud. I walked down the long paved driveway and turned the corner, stepping out of their line of sight. But I did not continue down the street. I waited exactly 10 minutes, standing quietly behind the large brick pillar of my neighbor's fencing. Then I turned back. I moved silently, staying close to the thick, evergreen hedges that lined the perimeter of my estate. I approached the tall wooden side gate that led directly into the expansive backyard. I knew the latch was slightly rusted and prone to squeaking, so I lifted the heavy wooden panel slightly as I unlatched it, allowing it to open with absolute silence. I slipped into the backyard and concealed myself behind the large weeping willow tree near the edge of the stone patio. My garden was my absolute pride and joy. Diane and I had spent countless weekends planting the azalea bushes, laying the slate pathways, and building the large wooden pergola that provided shade during the humid summer months. It was a space designed for quiet reflection and family gatherings. But today, the sanctity of my garden was being deeply violated. Standing squarely in the middle of the manicured lawn was Derek. He was not alone. He was accompanied by 3 men I had never seen before. They were not wearing the casual attire of neighborhood friends or the standard polo shirts of local contractors. They were dressed in sharp, meticulously tailored dark suits. They wore expensive leather shoes that looked entirely out of place sinking into the soft winter grass. One of the men was smoking a thick cigar, casually flicking the gray ash onto Diane's prized rose bushes. Another held a leather portfolio writing notes with a sleek silver pen. They moved with a predatory confidence, their eyes scanning the expansive property, examining the slate roof, the custom windows, and the deep wooded lot line. Derek stood in the center of the group, his chest puffed out, his hand resting confidently on his hips. He was pointing toward the main structure of the house, sweeping his arm in a broad, expansive gesture. He was giving them a guided tour of my property, acting with the absolute authority of a wealthy landowner, showing off his vast domain. I held my breath, remaining perfectly still behind the draping branches of the weeping willow. The biting wind carried their voices clearly across the open lawn. I focused intently on Derek's words, filtering out the rustling leaves and the distant traffic. "As you can see, gentlemen," Derek said loudly, his voice brimming with a sickening manufactured bravado. The property sits on over 2 acres of prime, fully developed real estate in one of the most exclusive zip codes in the entire state. The structural integrity is flawless, and the market value has absolutely skyrocketed in the last 5 years alone. The man with the cigar took a long, slow drag and blew the thick smoke into the crisp air. He looked at the main house, his eyes narrowing in cold calculation. It is a substantial asset, Derek. I will give you that. The location is excellent, but we need absolute assurances. Our capital is not a charity fund. If we bridge this gap for your company, we need to know the asset is fully unencumbered and completely accessible. Derek laughed, a smooth, deeply arrogant sound that made my stomach churn with intense disgust. He stepped closer to the men, lowering his voice just slightly, but not enough to escape my hearing. I understand your concerns, gentlemen, but I promise you there is absolutely zero risk here. You have seen the initial paperwork I provided. The collateral is rock solid. My inheritance is guaranteed. The word inheritance hit me like a physical blow. A man cannot inherit an estate from a living father-in-law. An inheritance only passes hands when the current owner is dead or legally stripped of their rights and assets entirely. My mind raced, piecing together the shredded bank letter, the missing diamonds, the gaslighting, and this secret clandestine tour of my home. They were leveraging my house to fund his failing ambitions. The man holding the leather portfolio stopped writing and looked up, his gaze drifting toward the basement windows of my suite. He tapped his silver pen against the dark leather. What about the current title holder? The man asked, his tone flat and purely transactional. What about the old man? Is he going to pose a legal problem for us when the transfer hits? Derek stuffed his hands into the pockets of his expensive wool coat. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, revealing a darkness I had never truly comprehended until this very second. He looked back at the grand house I had built to protect my beloved family, his eyes devoid of any human empathy. Don't worry about Victor, Derek replied, his voice dropping into a cold, ruthless whisper that carried through the freezing winter air. He won't be a problem much longer. The chilling words hung heavily in the freezing air, an absolute promise of my impending erasure. The paralyzing shock that gripped me over the past weeks evaporated completely, replaced by crystalline clarity. Derek was not just a greedy opportunist stealing jewelry. He was a dangerous predator actively plotting my ruin. I waited patiently until the men in tailored suits finally shook Derek's hand and walked to their luxury vehicles. I listened carefully as Derek whistled a cheerful tune, strolling casually inside my house as if he had just conquered a nation. Once the heavy back door clicked firmly shut, I immediately retraced my steps, slipped quietly through the rusted side gate, and re-entered the house through the cold basement. A seasoned structural engineer knows perfectly well that when a towering building is on the verge of total collapse, you do not attempt to patch the deep cracks with cheap plaster. You brace the failing foundation with heavy, cold steel. I could no longer fight this silent psychological war, relying solely on my own limited observations. I needed a professional expert. I needed a shark. The following morning, I dressed carefully in my best wool trousers and a crisp collared shirt. I walked slowly upstairs to the bright kitchen where Rachel was casually sipping a green smoothie. I told her in the frailest, most pathetic voice I could possibly muster that I was taking the city bus down to the community center to play chess. She barely glanced my way, offering a cold, dismissive wave. I walked out the front door, leaning heavily on a wooden walking cane, perfectly playing the part of the broken man they wanted me to be. As soon as I was 3 quiet blocks away, I straightened my back, folded the wooden cane, and ordered an Uber. The long ride into downtown Washington was a rapid blur of gray concrete. I watched the towering corporate buildings pass by massive structures that stood tall and defiant against the skyline. I drew immense quiet strength from them. I was Victor Thorne, a man who built massive monuments that easily withstood hurricanes. I would not allow a pathetic, arrogant parasite to tear my life down. The black Uber dropped me off at a sleek high-rise on K Street. I rode the express elevator directly to the 34th floor and stepped into the plush, intimidating reception area of Cole & Associates. Harrison Cole was not just a lawyer. He was a ruthless legal mercenary. For 30 long years, he had been my exclusive corporate attorney, aggressively defending my engineering firm against frivolous lawsuits and navigating complex municipal contracts. He ate corporate predators for breakfast. The polished receptionist recognized me instantly and ushered me directly into Harrison's massive corner office. Harrison was sitting confidently behind a massive slab of polished mahogany. He was a sharp, imposing, silver-haired man with piercing, hawk-like eyes. He looked up clearly surprised by my sudden arrival, but quickly stood to shake my hand. I did not waste any time with empty pleasantries. I sat down in the leather chair, reached deep into my pocket, and pulled out the small pouch containing the shredded, taped-together bank letter. I placed it gently onto his immaculate desk and told him absolutely everything. I detailed the agonizing, slow invasion of my home, the destroyed antique vanity, the stolen diamond necklace, the secret garden tour, and the chilling conversation I had secretly overheard yesterday. Harrison listened with a terrifying, absolute stillness, his sharp eyes visibly darkening with a cold, highly professional fury. He carefully picked up the reconstructed bank letter and examined it silently under the bright glow of his desk lamp. "Victor," Harrison finally said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "This is not a simple, isolated case of elder abuse. This is a highly orchestrated, complex financial crime. They are actively trying to liquidate your entire life." Harrison immediately turned to his computer, his fingers flying rapidly across the black keyboard. "I am pulling the county property records right now," he muttered intensely. "I also have direct channels with the internal fraud department at your bank. If they initiated a home equity line of credit using your property as collateral, the digital footprint will be sitting right in the centralized database." The grand office fell into a tense, utterly suffocating silence. I listened closely to the frantic clicking of his keyboard. Every single passing second felt like an agonizing hour. I watched his eyes narrow sharply as he rapidly scrolled through pages of dense digital financial information. Then he abruptly stopped. He let out a harsh, bitter breath and leaned back heavily in his expensive leather chair. "It is infinitely worse than you thought, Victor," Harrison said grimly. "The $1.5 million line of credit is absolutely real. But it is not just in the preliminary application phase. It is currently in the final underwriting stage. The bank has already completed a drive-by appraisal of your entire estate. The massive funds are scheduled to be dispersed directly into a newly created joint account in exactly 14 days. In 2 short weeks, Derek will have direct, unfettered access to $1.5 million of your home's equity." I felt the warm blood completely drain from my face. "How is that even remotely possible, Harrison? I never spoke to a single loan officer. I never signed a single application. They need a physical signature. They need a certified notary. They absolutely need my physical presence to authorize a massive loan against an unencumbered property." Harrison's intense expression turned remarkably grim. He opened a new digital tab, navigated quickly to a specific legal database, and downloaded a hidden file. The office printer hummed loudly to life, spitting out a thick stack of warm paper. Harrison stapled the top corner securely and slowly slid the heavy, damning document across the polished mahogany desk directly toward me. "They did not need your physical presence anywhere, Victor," Harrison said quietly, tapping his index finger hard against the very top page. "Because legally speaking, you gave them absolute undisputed permission to do whatever they want." I stared blankly down at the document. The bold black letters printed at the top of the page seemed to burn directly into my retinas. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. I read the terrifying, legally binding clauses. The document granted Rachel Thorne Mitchell complete and total control over all of my financial assets, my personal banking accounts, my real estate holdings, and my healthcare decisions. It legally declared that she was fully authorized to act as my sole agent in all matters, effectively stripping me of my autonomy. "I never drafted this," I whispered softly, my voice shaking with profound, absolute horror. "I never saw this document in my entire life." "Look closely at the bottom of the very last page, Victor," Harrison explicitly instructed, his steady tone heavily laced with a simmering, lethal anger. I flipped frantically through the thick pages. There, at the very bottom of the final sheet, right next to the official blue stamp of a deeply negligent notary public, was my signature. It was not a sloppy, quickly rushed imitation. It was a flawless, absolutely perfect replication of my distinct personal handwriting. Every flowing loop, every sharp angle, and every subtle pressure point was exactly how I had signed thousands of complex architectural blueprints over my 40-year career. It was a master forgery. The brutal reality of Harrison's revelation hung heavily in the freezing air of the Grand Office, an absolute promise of my impending erasure. The paralyzing shock that gripped me over the past few weeks evaporated entirely instantly, replaced by crystalline clarity. Derek was not just a greedy opportunist trying to steal jewelry or comfortably live rent-free in my house. He was a dangerous, calculating predator, actively plotting my total ruin. Harrison stared at the document, his jaw set so tightly I could clearly see the muscles feathering beneath his skin. For a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the treacherous waters of corporate litigation, he rarely showed genuine shock. But this brazen act of criminality executed against a client he considered a long-standing friend had crossed a deeply personal line. He carefully placed the paper back onto the polished mahogany desk and looked at me with a cold, terrifying determination. We were no longer dealing with an entitled son-in-law. We were dealing with a desperate, cornered criminal who had systematically planned to strip me of every single asset I had built over 40 years of grueling work. "Victor, we cannot afford to simply react," Harrison stated, his voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper. "If we file a police report right now based on this forgery, Derek will instantly know we are onto his scheme. He will panic. He will shred whatever physical evidence remains in your house, drain whatever liquid accounts he currently has access to, and possibly flee the jurisdiction entirely. Or worse, he will accelerate whatever physical timeline he has planned for you. We need absolute, overwhelming proof of his entire operation before we strike. We need to completely dismantle him." I nodded slowly, feeling a cold, dark resolve settling deep into my bones. The profound shock was entirely gone, replaced by the precise, calculating mindset of a structural engineer analyzing a building scheduled for demolition. "What is our next move, Harrison?" Harrison reached for his desk phone and pressed a single button on the intercom. He instructed his secretary to cancel all his afternoon appointments and immediately summon a man named Marcus Vance. 20 minutes later, the heavy oak door of the office opened. Marcus was a former federal forensic accountant who now ran an elite, highly discreet private investigation firm catering specifically to high-net-worth clients facing complex financial extortion. He was a quiet, unassuming man with sharp eyes that seemed to instantly categorize every single object in the room. Harrison quickly briefed him on the situation, sliding the forged power of attorney and the shredded bank letter across the desk. Marcus reviewed the documents with total silence, his expression completely unreadable. "I want a complete, comprehensive shadow investigation into Derek Mitchell," Harrison instructed firmly. "I want to know where every single cent of his money comes from and exactly where it goes. I want to know the absolute truth about this tech startup he claims to be running from my client's home. Dig into his personal accounts, his digital footprint, and his business filings. Leave absolutely no stone unturned." Marcus nodded simply, gathering the files into a sleek leather briefcase. "Give me exactly 72 hours. I will bring you the entire structural breakdown of his life." For the next 3 days, my own home felt like an active war zone, where the enemy was entirely unaware that the battle had already begun. I continued to play the role of the frail, mentally declining father perfectly. I walked with a pronounced limp. I intentionally left the stove burner on for a few minutes, until Rachel noticed, apologizing profusely for my dangerous forgetfulness, while Derek watched me with that sickening, triumphant smirk. Every time I looked at him, I felt a violent surge of rage, but I forcefully pushed it down. I was buying Marcus the precious time he needed to uncover the absolute truth. On Friday morning, Harrison called my encrypted burner phone, a device he had specifically purchased for me to ensure Derek could not intercept our communications on the home network. He told me to come to the office immediately. When I arrived, Marcus was already sitting in the leather chair opposite Harrison's desk. The large glass table in the center of the room was completely covered in thick, color-coded financial dossiers. Marcus did not offer a warm greeting. He simply pointed to the largest stack of papers on the table. "Your son-in-law is not a technology entrepreneur, Victor." Marcus began, his tone entirely clinical and devoid of emotion. "The company he claims to be running, the one that supposedly requires your library for a corporate headquarters, is a complete and utter sham. It is a legally registered entity, but it has absolutely zero operational infrastructure. It has 0 employees on payroll, 0 active clients, and 0 viable products in development. It is nothing more than a hollow financial shell designed specifically to look legitimate on paper." I stared at the thick dossiers, feeling a cold wave of vindication. Then what exactly is he doing in my library for 10 hours a day? Marcus pulled a secondary folder from the table and opened it. "He is aggressively day trading cryptocurrency, and he is spectacularly bad at it. Over the last 14 months, Derek has systematically liquidated his entire personal savings, his retirement accounts, and a substantial portion of Rachel's inheritance from her grandmother. He gambled away nearly $700,000 chasing highly volatile digital coins on unregulated offshore exchanges. The sheer magnitude of the financial destruction took my breath away. He had not just ruined his own financial future. He had actively decimated my daughter's financial security while smiling directly in my face every single morning. But losing his own money was not the catalyst for his current actions." Marcus continued, his voice growing significantly darker. "When the legitimate funds ran dry 6 months ago, Derek became desperate. He borrowed heavily to try and recover his massive losses. He did not go to a standard bank. He went to unregulated, highly dangerous private lenders. Loan sharks. He currently owes in excess of $400,000 in high-interest debt to individuals who do not send polite collection letters. They are threatening him. That is the intense pressure driving his actions. That is exactly why he forged your signature to secure a $1.5 million line of credit against your unencumbered estate. He is literally trying to save his own life by actively destroying yours." It all made terrifying absolute sense. The aggressive takeover of my home, the destruction of Diane's vanity to exert dominance, the interception of the Daily Mail. He was a desperate, drowning man, pulling me under the freezing water to keep himself afloat. "We have enough financial evidence right here to send him to federal prison for a decade," Harrison said, placing his hands firmly on the desk. "We can initiate the legal strike tomorrow morning. There is one final piece of the puzzle you both need to see before you make your move," Marcus interrupted, pulling a single thin folder from his briefcase. He did not slide it across the table. He held it in his hands, looking directly at me with a profound, uncharacteristic level of deep human sympathy. "During my digital investigation, I gained access to Derek's deleted email archives and his private browser history," Marcus explained softly. "I wanted to know what his exit strategy was once the bank dispersed the $1.5 million into the joint account. Stealing the money is only half the battle. He still needed a permanent way to neutralize you, Victor. He needed to ensure you could never legally challenge the fraudulent transfer or report the massive theft to the police." A heavy, icy dread pooled in the very bottom of my stomach. "What did he do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Marcus opened the thin folder and placed a printed email thread directly in front of me. 2 weeks ago, right around the time he started convincing Rachel that your memory was failing, Derek contacted the admissions director of a highly exclusive private luxury nursing facility located in a remote part of upstate New York. It is a specialized high-security facility designed specifically for patients suffering from severe advanced stage dementia and profound cognitive decline. I looked down at the printed words on the page, my eyes scanning the horrific, calculated correspondence. Derek had been actively negotiating the monthly care fees, using my own stolen funds to pay for the permanent accommodation. He sent them your medical records heavily altered to exaggerate your minor joint issues into major physical liabilities, Marcus continued grimly. He explicitly invoked the forged power of attorney to bypass your required consent for the medical transfer. He specifically inquired about their locked ward protocols. He wanted absolute written assurance from the facility director that once a patient is admitted under a medical directive by a legal proxy, the patient cannot discharge themselves under any circumstances, regardless of their perceived lucidity. The room spun slightly. I gripped the wooden arms of the leather chair to steady myself. They were not just planning to steal my money and leave me destitute. They were planning to lock me away in a secure, isolated medical facility. They were going to chemically sedate me, strip away my fundamental human rights, and leave me to rot in a locked ward until I died completely alone and entirely forgotten. "When is the admission date?" I asked, forcing the terrifying words past the tight, suffocating lump in my throat. Marcus looked down at the final page of the document. He finalized the involuntary admission paperwork yesterday afternoon. They are coming to collect you on Friday morning. I took a slow breath. I let the chilling reality of Friday morning wash over me, settling deep into my bones. Today was Tuesday. I had exactly 72 hours to dismantle the trap constructed around my life. Knowing the truth was no longer sufficient. I needed undeniable evidence of their malicious intent. I needed to capture their conspiracy in real time, bypassing financial documents entirely. I needed them to confess to an empty room. To achieve this, I had to completely lean into the pathetic caricature they had painted of me. I had to become the helpless old man they were eager to lock away. On Wednesday morning, I put my plan into motion. I waited until I heard Derek pacing across the hardwood floors above. I climbed the wooden stairs, making sure my breathing sounded ragged. As I reached the kitchen, I intentionally allowed my right leg to buckle. I let out a sharp, loud cry of pain, gripping the edge of the granite countertop, as if my life depended on it, and collapsed heavily onto the floor. Rachel gasped, dropping her ceramic coffee mug into the sink with a loud clatter. Derek stared down at me with a cold, analytical gaze. "Dad, what happened?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling slightly. "My back," I groaned, clutching my lower spine. "It is a severe spasm. I can barely move my legs. The pain is blinding." Derek crouched down. "Do you need me to call an ambulance, Victor? We can have you taken to the emergency room for an evaluation." I knew exactly what an emergency room visit meant. It meant medical records, vulnerability, and a fast track to the locked ward facility he had selected for me. I shook my head adamantly. "No hospitals," I rasped. "I just need uninterrupted rest. Help me get back down to my bed in the basement. I do not want to be a burden up here." The flash of profound relief that crossed Derek's face was unmistakable. A bedridden father-in-law trapped in the basement was the perfect precursor to an involuntary medical extraction on Friday morning. Derek and Rachel practically carried my dead weight down the narrow stairs. I groaned at every single step, delivering the greatest performance of my life. They deposited me onto the firm mattress. I closed my eyes, asking them to please leave me in complete darkness so I could try to sleep. "We will check on you later, Victor," Derek said smoothly. "Just rest. Do not try to move." I listened intently as their footsteps retreated up the stairs. The heavy basement door clicked shut. I waited exactly 4 hours in total silence. I did not move a single muscle. I lay there calculating the optimal angles and field of vision for what I was about to do. At 6 o'clock that evening, I heard the muffled sounds of preparation above. Rachel and Derek were getting ready to go out. Derek had bragged about a crucial dinner with his new private investors at an upscale downtown steakhouse. I heard the front door close. I listened as the heavy engine roared to life, the tires crunching against the pavement as they pulled away. The house fell into a hollow silence. I threw off the covers and stood up, my spine straight, my legs steady and strong. Hidden deep inside my heavy winter coat was a small black case I had procured directly from Marcus yesterday. It contained a set of 4 military-grade high-definition microcameras. These were sophisticated motion-activated recording units equipped with infrared night vision, extreme wide-angle lenses, and direct cellular uplink capabilities. I grabbed the case and bounded up the basement stairs. I knew every structural beam, every hidden wire, and every subtle shadow within these walls. I had built this sanctuary, and I knew exactly how to wire it. I dragged a chair to the center of the room. I popped off the cover of the corner smoke detector. Working precisely, I spliced the microcamera's wire into the electrical feed, drilling a microscopic hole for the lens to peek through. It was entirely invisible from the floor, perfectly camouflaged against the white ceiling. Next, I moved to the kitchen. This was the central hub of their daily operations, the place where Derek issued his commands, and Rachel offered her silent compliance. I climbed onto the granite countertop, reaching into the dark recess above the highest cabinet door. I secured the second camera, angling the lens downward to capture the entire kitchen island. I wired it directly into the hidden LED circuit. The final location was my former library. This was the belly of the beast, the room where he shredded my mail, forged my signature, and communicated with dangerous loan sharks. I approached the heavy double doors, my heart beating a steady drum, and stepped inside. I needed 2 cameras here to capture both the desk area and the main seating space. I walked over to the towering walnut bookshelves I had built with my own hands. I pulled out a heavy volume on Gothic architecture, carefully hollowed out the thick spine using a utility knife, and embedded the third camera. The lens was completely hidden in the dark crease between the pages, offering a wide-angle view of the desk. For the fourth camera, I unscrewed the bronze heating vent near the bay window. I secured the tiny device against the inner metal wall, positioning the lens to look through the angled slats. It provided a perfect cross-angle of the entire room. The installation process took exactly 5 hours. My muscles ached from the intense labor, but my mind was incredibly sharp. I walked through the main floors, meticulously erasing any subtle trace of my presence. I left the house looking exactly as they had left it. I retreated down the stairs, descending back into the cold isolation of my basement suite. I closed the door quietly, feeling a profound sense of tactical accomplishment. I washed my hands in the small bathroom sink, changed back into my sleeping clothes, and sat on the edge of the firm mattress. I reached under my pillow and pulled out the iPad Marcus had provided. I powered on the device, launching the encrypted security application and entering the complex sequence of alphanumeric passwords. The screen blinked twice, clearing the loading sequence. The display split into 4 distinct high-definition video feeds. I could see the grand living room, the pristine kitchen, and the 2 perfect angles of the library. The infrared sensors rendered the dark, empty house in sharp, highly detailed shades of gray and white. The audio feeds were incredibly sensitive, picking up the low, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the distant hallway. I settled back against the cold wall, resting the glowing iPad on my knees. I watched the 4 silent screens, the ultimate architect of my own defense, patiently waiting in the shadows. The digital trap was fully set, powered, and actively recording. 20 minutes later, the distinct sound of tires crunching on the paved driveway echoed loudly through the sensitive audio feeds. I watched the kitchen screen intently. The heavy front door swung open, casting a long, stark shadow across the hardwood floor. Rachel and Derek walked through the doorway, laughing loudly, entirely unaware they had just stepped directly onto a live, heavily monitored stage. The performance was about to begin, and I was holding the director's script. I watched the tablet screen illuminate the dark walls of my basement prison. Rachel and Derek moved through the kitchen with an easy domestic rhythm. Derek poured 2 glasses of red wine, while Rachel picked at a platter of imported cheeses. They looked like a normal, successful young couple, unwinding after a long day of corporate meetings. To the untrained eye, their interactions were mundane and loving. But through the lens of my hidden cameras, their casual laughter sounded hollow and sinister. I sat rigidly on my mattress for hours, my eyes darting between the video feeds, recording every frame. The timer in the corner of my screen ticked past midnight. The house above me grew quiet. The kitchen feed went dark as Derek flicked off the lights. A moment later, the screen displaying the library burst into monochrome clarity. The infrared sensors detected movement in the room. Derek walked into my former sanctuary carrying a glass of amber liquid. He sat down heavily in the leather chair behind the desk, rubbing his temples with his hand. He did not look like a confident technology pioneer anymore. In the harsh light, he looked like an exhausted man carrying a massive burden. The silence in the basement was absolute save for the beating of my heart. I adjusted the volume controls on the tablet, ensuring I would capture every sound. A few minutes later, the heavy wooden doors of the library swung open again. Rachel walked into the room wrapped in a thick cashmere robe. She closed the doors behind her and locked the brass latch with a distinct click that echoed through my earphones. The atmosphere on the screen shifted instantly. The domestic warmth they had displayed completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating tension. I leaned closer to the glowing tablet, pressing the earbuds deeper into my ears to catch every syllable. My heart hammered violently against my ribs with a heavy, painful rhythm. "Did you speak with the brokers today?" Rachel asked, her voice dropping into an anxious whisper as she paced back and forth across the Persian rug. Derek took a slow sip from his glass and nodded, leaning forward to rest his elbows on the smooth glass surface of the desk. "I spent the afternoon finalizing the wire transfer protocols," Derek replied smoothly, his tone laced with a dark, triumphant energy. "The bank underwriters cleared the final property appraisal this morning. The financial paperwork is locked in. Once the $1.5 million line of credit clears our joint account on the 26th of this month, the nightmare is over. We will transfer the funds immediately. The private lenders will be paid off by noon. Those violent animals will stop calling my private numbers. My debts will be wiped clean." I watched my daughter stop pacing. She stood in front of the desk, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. I waited in the cold darkness for a natural human reaction. I waited for her to acknowledge the magnitude of the financial crime they were committing against her flesh and blood. I prayed to hear a single shred of moral hesitation in her voice. "And what are we going to do about the secondary problem?" Rachel asked flatly, her voice devoid of any human emotion. "We cannot celebrate our financial freedom if he is still wandering around the house calling his bank or trying to contact his lawyer. We need to stick to the established timeline." The sterile detachment in her voice shattered my heart into a million pieces. She was talking about her father as if I were a broken appliance that needed to be discarded, a logistical nuisance standing in the way of her comfort. She did not even refer to me by name. I was simply the secondary problem. Derek smiled a chilling, predatory expression that distorted his handsome features on the screen. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The secondary problem is already handled," Derek assured her, his voice brimming with a sickening arrogance. "The medical facility in upstate New York sent over the final admission manifest this afternoon. The locked ward has a private, isolated suite prepared for him. We shove your dad into the transport van on the morning of the 27th. The medical couriers will handle the extraction from the house. We will not have to lift a single finger." Derek paused, taking another deliberate sip of his drink before delivering the final blow. "Once the transport van leaves the driveway, we drive straight to the international airport. We are flying first class to Hawaii for New Year's Eve. We will be drinking expensive champagne on the beach while he gets permanently settled into his new medicated home." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring, with a toxic mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. I felt physical pain radiating through my chest, a deep ache that threatened to suffocate me in the dark basement. My daughter was conspiring to lock me in a chemical prison so she could take a tropical vacation funded entirely by my stolen savings. I held my ragged breath, desperately waiting for Rachel to finally speak. This was the absolute point of no return. A tiny, foolish part of my shattered soul still desperately hoped she would break down, that she would realize the monstrous nature of their plan and refuse to go through with it. I wanted her to cry. I wanted her to defend me. Rachel did not cry. She did not defend her father. She did not show a single ounce of remorse, empathy, or hesitation. She simply uncrossed her arms, stepped closer to the glass desk, and looked down at her husband with an expression of pure, calculating pragmatism. "Are you absolutely sure the specialized doctors will sign off on his severe dementia?" Rachel asked coldly, her tone sharp and precise. "If the intake physicians at the facility question his lucidity during the initial psychiatric evaluation, they might reject the involuntary admission. The legal proxy is useless if the medical staff determines he is fully competent and aware of his surroundings. We cannot afford any loose ends or legal complications." Derek chuckled softly, a dark, vibrating sound that echoed loudly through my earphones. He reached down into the lower drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder. He tossed it onto the glass surface. The heavy folder landed with a dull, definitive thud. "You worry far too much, my love," Derek said confidently, tapping his index finger against the top of the manila cover. "I spent $10,000 of the advance money to hire a private, highly unethical neurologist who specializes in discrete medical certifications. He never even had to meet your father in person to diagnose him. I provided the doctor with a fully fabricated list of terrifying symptoms and aggressive behavioral anomalies. He drafted a completely airtight, highly detailed diagnostic report, officially confirming advanced cognitive decline and severe paranoia." Derek held up the forged medical file, waving it slightly in the air as his dark smirk widened into a victorious, triumphant grin. "Already done." The triumphant grin on Derek's face burned through the glowing screen of my tablet, searing itself permanently into my memory. Already done. Those two simple words echoed in the cold, damp air of the basement, sealing the absolute death of the family I thought I knew. I sat on the edge of the firm mattress, watching the silent video feed, as Derek casually tossed the forged medical file back into his desk drawer and locked it. Rachel merely nodded, her face a mask of chilling indifference, before wrapping her thick cashmere robe tighter around her shoulders and turning toward the library doors. I watched them walk out, plunging the room back into darkness. I did not weep. The profound, suffocating grief that had threatened to crush my chest only moments ago completely evaporated, replaced instantly by an icy, absolute resolve. The daughter I had lovingly raised, the little girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and whose expensive college tuition I had paid without a single moment of hesitation, was officially gone. In her place stood a ruthless accomplice to a monstrous crime. They were not just stealing my home. They were stealing my freedom, my dignity, and my future. I pressed the power button on the iPad, plunging my small sanctuary into total darkness. The time for mourning was definitively over. The time for absolute destruction had arrived. When I finally opened my eyes again, pale gray light was filtering through the single narrow window near the ceiling of my basement suite. It was the early morning of Christmas Eve. Outside, a thick layer of pristine white snow blanketed the sweeping lawns of my estate, creating a picturesque winter wonderland that sharply contrasted with the ugly, rotting reality festering inside the walls of the house. For decades, Christmas Eve had been a sacred, joyous tradition in our home. Diane would spend days baking cinnamon pastries, and the house would be filled with the warm, rich scents of pine needles and roasting meats. We would sit by the crackling fireplace, listening to classic carols, cherishing the simple warmth of our family. Now the festive holiday was nothing more than a convenient ticking clock, marking the final countdown to my planned institutionalization. Tomorrow was the 26th of December. Tomorrow was the day the $1.5 million line of credit was scheduled to clear. Tomorrow was the day they intended to pay off the violent loan sharks. And the day after tomorrow, the 27th, was the day the medical transport van was supposed to arrive to haul me away to a locked dementia ward. I threw off the thin blankets and stood up, ignoring the biting cold of the concrete floor. I had to maintain my performance with absolute flawless precision. I dressed slowly, choosing a faded, slightly wrinkled flannel shirt and oversized trousers to emphasize my supposed physical decline. I practiced a vacant, confused expression in the small bathroom mirror, letting my shoulders slump heavily forward. I grasped the wooden walking cane I had strategically placed by the door and began my slow, agonizingly loud ascent up the wooden stairs. I pushed open the heavy door to the main hallway and shuffled toward the kitchen. The grand space was filled with the vibrant, energetic sounds of holiday preparation. Rachel was standing at the granite countertop, elegantly arranging an expensive charcuterie board, while Derek was leaning against the stainless steel refrigerator, rapidly typing on his sleek smartphone. When I entered the room, the casual domestic atmosphere shifted just slightly. "Good morning, Dad," Rachel said, her voice dripping with a bright, entirely synthetic cheerfulness. She did not look at my eyes. She focused entirely on slicing a block of aged cheese. "Did you sleep well down there? I know the furnace can be a little loud, but we wanted to make sure you stayed nice and warm." "I slept fine, Rachel," I replied, forcing my voice to tremble with a manufactured, pathetic frailty. "My back is still incredibly stiff. The cold weather settles deep into my joints." Derek slipped his phone into the pocket of his tailored slacks and walked over to the kitchen island, picking up a steaming mug of black coffee. He looked at me with that familiar, deeply insulting expression of patronizing pity. It took every ounce of my willpower not to strike him across his smug, arrogant face. "You need to take it very easy today, Victor," Derek advised smoothly, his tone laced with a thick, suffocating layer of fake concern. "With your memory slipping the way it has been lately, and your physical health visibly deteriorating, you absolutely must avoid any unnecessary stress. We have been reading up on cognitive decline, and highly stimulating environments are incredibly detrimental. You just need to focus on resting your mind. Let us handle the heavy lifting for the family. We have everything completely under control." The sheer audacity of his words was staggering. He was actively laying the final psychological groundwork for my impending disappearance, gently conditioning me to accept my role as a helpless burden. I slowly lowered myself into a wooden chair at the breakfast nook, gripping the curved handle of my cane with trembling, spotted hands. "You are right, Derek," I mumbled quietly, staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor. "My mind feels so foggy lately. I just cannot seem to keep my thoughts straight anymore. I appreciate everything you both are doing for me." Derek shot a quick, triumphant glance at Rachel. He thought I was completely broken. He thought the heavy pressure he had applied over the last 8 months had successfully crushed my spirit and shattered my mental fortitude. He had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting for the perfect moment to detonate the foundation beneath his feet. After eating a small bowl of plain oatmeal in suffocating silence, I excused myself, claiming that the bright lights of the kitchen were giving me a terrible headache. I shuffled slowly back down the hallway, leaning heavily on my cane, and descended into the dark isolation of the basement. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the frail, confused old man vanished entirely. I stood up perfectly straight, tossed the wooden cane onto the bed, and pulled the encrypted burner phone from the inner pocket of my coat. I sat at the small desk in the corner of the room and composed a highly secure, encrypted text message to Harrison Cole. We had meticulously planned this exact sequence of events for weeks. The legal trap was heavily primed, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. "The timeline is absolutely confirmed," I typed swiftly. At 5 o'clock, the heavy basement door opened with a loud creak. Derek stepped onto the bottom stair wearing an immaculate charcoal suit. He looked down at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Listen carefully, Victor," Derek commanded aggressively. "Important investors are coming for a private Christmas dinner tonight. You are an embarrassment to my image. Stay in the basement tonight. Do not make a single sound." I merely nodded to the empty room, a silent wolf in sheep's clothing, patiently waiting for the dawn. The heavy basement door finally clicked shut, leaving me in the cold darkness. I did not stay on the mattress. I waited exactly 2 hours until the muffled sounds of clinking crystal and deep laughter filtered through the floorboards above. The dinner party was in full swing. I walked over to the small closet and stripped off the oversized flannel shirt and the baggy trousers. I reached into the very back and pulled out the protective garment bag I had hidden days ago. Inside was my finest bespoke suit, a tailored navy blue wool masterpiece with a crisp white shirt. I buttoned the shirt with steady, precise movements. I tied the silk tie in a perfect knot. I slipped into my polished leather Oxfords. I stood in front of the small bathroom mirror and looked at my reflection. The stooped, trembling, pathetic old man was entirely gone. In his place stood Victor Thorne, the master structural engineer, the man who built skyscrapers out of steel and concrete. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling a surge of absolute power flow through my veins. I picked up the glowing iPad from the bed and checked the live digital video feed. The dining room screen showed Derek sitting at the head of my long mahogany table, pouring expensive vintage wine for 4 distinct men. I zoomed in on their faces. I recognized every single one of them instantly from the thick financial dossiers Marcus had provided. They were not wearing the sharp, meticulously tailored dark suits they had worn during the secret garden tour. They were dressed in expensive casual wear, attempting to blend into a suburban holiday setting. But I knew exactly who they really were. They were the highly dangerous, unregulated private lenders Derek owed his life to. They were ruthless loan sharks who specialized in shadow transactions and aggressive debt collection. Derek was actively selling them a beautiful, fabricated dream. I listened to his smooth, confident voice through the hidden audio feed. He was promising them that their massive capital injection was completely secure, that his technology startup was on the verge of a massive public offering, and that their principal investment would be returned with exorbitant interest by the end of the week. He was buying their patience with my stolen money and my vintage wine. I powered down the iPad and took a deep breath. It was time to tear the rotting foundation down. I walked to the bottom of the wooden stairs. I did not use the wooden cane. I left it discarded on the cold concrete floor. I climbed the stairs with firm, heavy, deliberate steps. I did not try to mask my approach. I wanted them to hear me coming. I reached the main hallway and turned toward the grand dining room. The heavy double doors were partially closed. I could hear Rachel laughing at a joke one of the loan sharks had made. Her synthetic joy echoed through the house. I placed both of my hands firmly on the polished brass handles and pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The thick wood swung back with a loud, authoritative crash that echoed like a gunshot through the opulent room. The laughter died instantly. The clinking of expensive crystal stopped dead. 5 heads turned rapidly in my direction. Rachel dropped her silver fork onto her china plate with a sharp clatter. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Derek froze midway through pouring a glass of red wine, the dark liquid spilling out. The wine splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, spreading like a fresh bloodstain. Derek stared at me in absolute paralyzing shock. He was looking at a man who was supposed to be a frail, broken shell, hiding in the dark basement. He was looking at a man standing tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating a cold, lethal authority. The thick veins in Derek's neck bulged as his shock violently transformed into pure, unadulterated panic. He slammed the wine bottle down onto the table and pushed his chair back with a harsh scraping sound that violently pierced the tense silence. "Victor!" Derek shouted, his voice cracking with desperate manufactured outrage as he scrambled to maintain his fragile illusion in front of his dangerous creditors. "What are you doing up here? I told you specifically to stay downstairs. You are highly confused again. You are having another severe episode. We have important business guests." He turned quickly to the 4 men, flashing a strained, sweaty smile. "I apologize, gentlemen. My father-in-law suffers from advanced dementia. He frequently wanders out of his room in a state of severe delusion. I will have him safely escorted back to his bed." Derek rushed aggressively toward me, reaching out his hands to physically grab my shoulders and force me out of the room. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground like a massive pillar of solid steel. When he closed the distance, I raised my right hand and pointed a single steady finger directly at his chest. "If you lay a single hand on me in my own home, Derek, I will ensure you spend the rest of your pathetic life locked inside a federal prison cell." I stated, my voice echoing with absolute cold command. Derek froze entirely. His hands hovered awkwardly in the air. The commanding tone of my voice, completely devoid of any frailty or confusion, shattered his entire narrative. I ignored his pathetic, trembling form and looked directly at the four men sitting at my table. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, clearly addressing the loan sharks with polite, chilling precision. "I apologize for the interruption, but you are being lied to by a desperate, drowning man. My son-in-law is not a technology entrepreneur. He does not own a startup company. He does not have a single legitimate client. He has gambled away hundreds of thousands of dollars on unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly why you are sitting at my table. He currently owes you an excess of $400,000 in high-interest private debt. He promised you a massive return on your investment by the 26th of this month." The four men remained completely silent, but their casual postures instantly evaporated. They sat up straight, their eyes turning into dark, predatory slits, as they shifted their collective, terrifying gaze directly onto Derek's sweating, panicking face. Rachel let out a muffled sob, burying her face in her hands. Derek was hyperventilating, his chest heaving, as his entire fraudulent empire collapsed around him in real time. "You are completely insane!" Derek screamed frantically, spinning around to face the silent men. "He is delusional. He does not know what he is talking about. I will call an ambulance right now." Derek lunged toward the heavy front door in the foyer to grab his coat. I stepped aside, reaching out to grasp the brass doorknob. Derek sneered, thinking the broken old man was retreating into the cold night. But I turned the heavy lock and pulled the door wide open. The freezing wind rushed through the doorway, carrying flakes of snow into the foyer. Standing framed in the threshold was Harrison Cole, flanked by two armed police officers. Flashing red and blue lights painted the lawn in chaotic colors. Harrison stepped across the threshold, his overcoat catching the swirling snow. He looked like an executioner arriving to drop the final blade. The officers stepped in behind him, scanning the dining room. The presence of law enforcement hit the dining room like a physical shockwave. The atmosphere shattered into absolute chaos. Sitting at the far end of the table, obscured by the centerpiece, were Derek's parents. They had evidently been invited to help maintain the sickening illusion of a thriving family for the private lenders. Upon seeing the armed police officers storming into the house, Derek's mother let out a sharp gasp. The crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers. It plummeted toward the floor, shattering into countless glittering pieces. The sound of breaking glass echoed across the vaulted ceiling. Derek's father jumped up from his chair, his face turning pale gray, completely paralyzed by the sudden intrusion. The four loan sharks did not show fear. They showed instant, hardened aggression. These were men who lived in the dangerous corners of the financial underworld. Seeing police officers triggered their deepest survival instincts. They pushed their heavy chairs back from the table. One of them subtly slid his right hand toward the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. The lead police officer instantly noticed the movement and firmly ordered the man to keep his hands flat on the tablecloth. The loan shark slowly complied, his dark eyes shooting a look of pure venom directly at Derek. They realized the lucrative narrative they had been sold was a complete fabrication. Derek was caught squarely in the center of the room, his chest heaving as he frantically tried to process the impossible nightmare. His eyes darted wildly between the armed officers, the furious loan sharks, his terrified parents, and me. The arrogance that usually defined his existence vanished, replaced by the sweating panic of a trapped animal. He raised his hands. Gentlemen, please remain perfectly calm, Derek stammered, forcing a pathetic, trembling smile. This is just a massive misunderstanding. My father-in-law is severely senile. He is suffering from advanced dementia. He has completely lost touch with reality. He must have called the police in a state of deep confusion, hallucinating that something was wrong. I assure you my company is perfectly solvent. The capital transfer is moving forward exactly as planned. This is just a medical episode. Please. Derek turned his desperate, pleading gaze toward Harrison. Officers, you have to listen to me, Derek pleaded rapidly. You are responding to a false alarm triggered by a mentally incompetent man. I am his primary caregiver. I hold his legal power of attorney. If you will step outside with me for one moment, I can show you his medical diagnostic file. I can prove he is suffering from severe cognitive decline. There is no crime happening here. Harrison Cole stepped forward, stopping at the very edge of the dining room rug. He stared down at Derek with an expression of unyielding contempt and retrieved a thick stack of folded legal documents. Save your breath, Mr. Mitchell, Harrison stated, his deep voice carrying a terrifying boom. We are not here to conduct a polite wellness check. We are here executing a coordinated arrest warrant for severe financial fraud, wire fraud conspiracy, to commit extortion and the forging of medical documents. The district attorney has already frozen your private bank accounts, including the joint account you illegally created 3 weeks ago. The $1.5 million line of credit has been permanently canceled. The game is entirely over. Derek took a staggering step backward. The sheer magnitude of Harrison's statement completely crushed his desperate defense. Rachel let out a loud wail, falling to her knees. Derek's mother began to sob uncontrollably, clinging tightly to her husband. The loan sharks remained seated, their expressions hardening into masks of calculating fury. They only cared that their money was gone, and the man who owed it to them was going to federal prison. Derek looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute hatred and utter disbelief. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his voice dropping into a vicious hiss as he tried to regain control. You have absolutely no tangible proof of anything, Derek spat, clinging desperately to his final lie. You are just a bitter old man making wild accusations. You cannot prove a single word you are saying. It is your word against mine, and the medical community knows your brain is rotting away. You cannot prove anything. I did not raise my voice. I remained standing tall near the open doorway, completely immune to his desperate thrashing. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and calmly pulled out my digital iPad. The screen was actively displaying the complex control panel for the hidden microcameras and integrated audio feeds I had meticulously installed. I looked directly into Derek's panicked eyes. I saw the exact moment the devastating realization hit him. He suddenly remembered the absolute solitude of his private library. He remembered the highly incriminating conversation he had conducted behind locked doors. He realized that the frail old man had never actually existed. I raised the iPad slightly, my thumb hovering over the audio playback controls. The house was equipped with a high-fidelity Bluetooth sound system. I had personally wired the speakers into the ceiling of every single room on the main floor years ago. I do not need to prove a single thing, Derek, I said quietly, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. You are going to prove it for me. I tapped the glowing screen. Instantly, the crystal-clear audio of Derek's own arrogant voice blared through the hidden speakers in the living room, the foyer, and the grand dining room. The secondary problem is already handled. Derek's recorded voice echoed loudly through the house. The medical facility in upstate New York sent over the final admission manifest this afternoon. The locked ward has a private, isolated suite prepared for him. We shove your dad into the transport van on the morning of the 27th. Once the transport van leaves the driveway, we drive straight to the international airport. We are flying first class to Hawaii for New Year's Eve. The recorded voice of my daughter, cold and calculating, followed immediately. Are you absolutely sure the specialized doctors will sign off on his severe dementia? You worry far too much, my love. Derek's recorded voice replied, brimming with a sickening, triumphant arrogance. I spent $10,000 of the advance money to hire a private, highly unethical neurologist. He drafted a completely airtight, highly detailed diagnostic report, officially confirming advanced cognitive decline and severe paranoia. Already done. The audio continued to loop seamlessly through the massive house. I stood perfectly still, watching the color completely drain from Derek's face as the inescapable reality of his own damning words surrounded him. The trap had sprung. The absolute finality of my recorded voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. The four private lenders did not need to hear another word. They possessed a predatory instinct for a failing investment, and they realized instantly that the lucrative narrative they had been confidently sold was nothing more than a desperate, rapidly evaporating illusion. The lead loan shark slowly stood up from the mahogany table. He did not look at the armed police officers standing squarely in the foyer. He locked his dark, furious gaze entirely on Derek. The sheer, unspoken violence radiating from the man was palpable. He knew his $400,000 was gone, and he clearly intended to extract that missing capital directly from Derek. Derek was trapped in a suffocating cage of his own creation. He backed away from the table, his shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor. The arrogant, untouchable tech entrepreneur was entirely gone, replaced by a trembling coward who finally realized he was completely surrounded by predators far more dangerous than himself. He threw his hands up, his eyes darting wildly between the loan sharks, the police officers, and my unyielding posture. "Listen to me, gentlemen. Please, just listen to me!" Derek screamed, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation. He gestured frantically toward the grand architecture. "The money is completely guaranteed. I swear to you, the money is secure. This house is fully appraised at $2.5 million. It is rock-solid collateral. The home equity line of credit is already underwritten and approved. It clears tomorrow morning. The full $1.5 million hits the account tomorrow. You will all be paid in full with the promised interest. Do not listen to this crazy old man or this fake recording. I have the legal binding power of attorney. I am in total control of the assets." He turned toward Harrison Cole, pointing a shaking finger. "You cannot stop a legally binding financial transfer." Derek sneered, trying desperately to summon false bravado. "I submitted all the required notarized paperwork. The bank has already processed the property lien. I am the designated legal proxy for this estate. You are trespassing, and you are actively interfering with a federally regulated financial transaction." Harrison Cole did not blink. The corporate litigator stepped forward into the bright light of the dining room chandelier. He moved with the slow, terrifying confidence of an apex predator closing in for the definitive kill. He carried a massive, thick, legal binder clad in dark blue leather. He did not say a single word as he approached the mahogany table. He simply lifted the heavy binder and dropped it squarely onto the polished wood surface. The massive thud echoed like a gavel striking a judge's bench, instantly silencing Derek's frantic, pathetic rambling. Harrison unbuttoned his expensive overcoat and looked directly at Derek with an expression of pure, unadulterated legal contempt. He placed his hands flat on the cover of the blue binder. "You are a remarkably stupid man, Mr. Mitchell." Harrison stated, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that commanded absolute authority in the tense room. "You believed you could simply forge a single document and effortlessly steal a lifetime of hard-earned wealth. You assumed you were playing a simple game of checkers against a vulnerable opponent. But my client has been playing high-stakes chess for 40 years, and he saw you coming a mile away. You are currently screaming about utilizing this property as collateral for a commercial loan. There is just one massive, insurmountable problem with your brilliant financial strategy. You cannot borrow against an asset you do not own." Derek stared at Harrison, his face twisting in genuine, profound confusion. His chest heaved as his mind desperately tried to process the impossible statement. "What are you talking about?" Derek stammered weakly, his eyes darting to Rachel, who was still weeping uncontrollably on the floor. "Victor has owned this estate for 30 years. The deed is entirely in his name. I ran the county property records myself. I stepped forward, moving away from the foyer, and standing directly beside Harrison. I looked at the man who had actively planned to lock me away in a chemical prison, feeling a deep, profound satisfaction welling up in my chest. The time for hiding in the shadows was permanently over. You ran the county property records 8 months ago, Derek, when you first moved into my home and began plotting your pathetic little takeover, I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady and clear. You assumed the structural foundation of my life would remain entirely static while you went about drilling holes into the support beams. But a master engineer never leaves his most valuable assets unprotected. I reached over and opened the heavy cover of the blue legal binder. I flipped past the index tabs and pointed to the primary notarized document sitting right on top. The moment I noticed the very first discrepancy in my bank statements, the very moment my antique vanity was mysteriously destroyed, I knew I was dealing with a parasite. I continued my gaze, boring directly into his terrified eyes. I did not just sit in the basement and wait for you to ruin me. 4 weeks ago, I quietly executed a complete legal restructuring of my entire financial portfolio. I removed my name from everything. I transferred this $2.5 million estate, my investment accounts, and all of my liquid assets directly into a highly secure, impenetrable, irrevocable trust. Derek's jaw fell completely open. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pallid gray. He understood the legal terminology perfectly. He realized exactly what I had done. I do not own this house, Derek, I stated, delivering the final fatal blow to his shattered reality. The trust owns this house. I am merely a beneficiary living on the premises. An irrevocable trust cannot be altered, modified, or leveraged by a standard power of attorney. The document you spent weeks painstakingly forging, the document you utilized to illegally secure a $1.5 million line of credit from a federally insured bank, is entirely fraudulent and completely void. The absolute silence in the dining room was deafening. The 4 private lenders stood perfectly still, their dark eyes fixed on Derek. They fully understood the brutal mathematics of the situation. There was no equity. There was no massive bank transfer happening tomorrow morning. There was absolutely no money to pay them back. Derek had leveraged an illusion, and the illusion had just violently evaporated. Derek stumbled backward, his knees buckling slightly as the crushing weight of his catastrophic failure crashed down upon him. He looked at the armed police officers waiting patiently in the foyer, holding heavy steel handcuffs. He looked at the furious loan sharks, who would undoubtedly be waiting for him the very second he ever managed to post bail. He had committed massive, documented bank fraud against a federal institution, and he owed violent criminals a small fortune he could never possibly repay. He had built a flawless trap for me, but he was the one locked firmly inside. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was finally broken by the scraping of wooden chair legs against the hardwood floor. The 4 private lenders stood up in absolute unison. They did not shout. They did not make any sudden, frantic movements. Men of their particular profession do not waste energy on useless theatrical displays when the authorities are standing mere feet away. The lead loan shark, the man who had been so pleasantly sipping my vintage wine just moments before, slowly buttoned his expensive jacket. He walked deliberately around the edge of the mahogany table, stopping just inches away from Derek. Derek shrank back, his shoulders trembling violently, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. The lender leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper that carried clearly across the quiet dining room. You have exactly 48 hours to find our capital, Mitchell. If you go to jail, we will wait. If you somehow post bail, we will find you. There is absolutely no hole deep enough for you to hide in. The man did not wait for a response. He simply adjusted his cuffs, turned his back on the trembling coward, and walked straight toward the foyer. The armed police officers smartly stepped aside, allowing the 4 men to exit the residence without a single word of confrontation. The heavy front door closed behind them, sealing Derek inside with the devastating consequences of his own monumental hubris. With the immediate threat of the loan sharks removed from the premises, the lead police officer stepped purposefully into the dining room. He unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. The sharp metallic clinking sound seemed to snap Derek out of his paralyzed stupor. He began to backpedal frantically, his expensive leather shoes sliding awkwardly against the Persian rug until his back hit the grand dining room window. "No, you cannot do this," Derek pleaded, holding his trembling hands out in front of his chest, as if he could physically stop the inevitable tide of justice. "I am a legitimate technology entrepreneur. This is just a terrible family misunderstanding. My father-in-law is confused. He does not understand complex financial vehicles. You cannot arrest me in my own home." The officer did not slow his methodical advance. He grabbed Derek by the shoulder forcefully, spinning him around and slamming his chest against the cold glass of the window. Derek let out a sharp, pathetic gasp as the heavy steel cuffs snapped tightly around his wrists, locking his hands firmly behind his back. "Derek Mitchell, you are under arrest for felony wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder abuse," the officer stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that filled the entire room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Derek thrashed weakly against the officer's firm grip, his perfectly styled hair now a tangled, sweaty mess across his forehead. He frantically twisted his neck, his wild, panicked eyes desperately searching the room until they locked onto his wife. "Rachel, please, you have to do something," Derek begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. "Tell them it was a joint decision. Tell them we were just trying to protect the estate. Call our best lawyers. Call someone. You cannot just let them take me away like this. We are supposed to go to Hawaii. We had a beautiful plan." Rachel remained rooted to the spot, entirely paralyzed by the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the collapse. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. She did not look up. She did not offer a single word of defense or comfort to the man she had conspired with to lock her own father away in a psychiatric ward. The absolute cowardice of their partnership was on full display. Derek then turned his desperate gaze toward the far end of the dining room table. His parents were still standing there, huddled closely together, shocked by the brutal destruction of their golden child. His mother was weeping openly, clutching a ruined linen napkin to her chest, while his father stared at the floor, his face pale and slack with profound, undeniable shame. They had eagerly come to this house to celebrate their son's manufactured success, and instead they were watching him be hauled away as a common, despicable thief. "Mom! Dad, please help me!" Derek cried out, tears of pure terror finally spilling down his cheeks. "Do not let them do this." His father slowly raised his head, looking at his son with an expression of deep, crushing disappointment. He did not step forward. He did not argue with the police officers. He simply wrapped his arm around his weeping wife and gently guided her toward the kitchen, completely turning his back on the criminal he had raised. The ultimate rejection hung heavily in the chilling air. The lead officer yanked Derek away from the window, guiding him toward the front door. Derek continued to blabber incoherently, begging, threatening, and crying all at once, his voice echoing pathetically down the long hallway. Harrison Cole stood quietly by the mahogany table, watching the spectacle with a cold, satisfied expression. I walked slowly to the front window, pulling the heavy velvet curtain aside just enough to watch the final act of this miserable play. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobed intensely against the fresh white snow, casting long, eerie shadows across the manicured winter lawn. I watched as the officers shoved Derek into the cramped back seat of the squad car. He looked incredibly small, a shattered, defeated man, completely stripped of his arrogant armor. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing his fate forever. The powerful engines roared to life and the cruisers slowly pulled away from the curb, their bright lights fading into the dark, freezing night until they completely disappeared from view. The grand house fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The immediate threat was permanently neutralized, but the deepest, most agonizing betrayal still lingered in the room. I turned away from the cold glass and looked down. Rachel had crawled across the hardwood floor. She was a mess of expensive cashmere and ruined makeup. She threw herself violently forward, wrapping her trembling arms tightly around my legs, burying her tear-stained face against my knees. She began to weep loudly, a desperate, hysterical sound that filled the empty dining room. "Daddy, I'm so sorry," Rachel sobbed uncontrollably, her tears soaking directly through the fabric of my trousers. He manipulated me so completely. Derek manipulated my mind. He convinced me that your memory was actually failing. He told me that we were protecting the family assets from being lost. I truly never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to send you away to that awful place. He forced me to agree with his plans. Please, you have to believe me. Please, Daddy, forgive me. Rachel remained crumpled on the Persian rug, her hands desperately clutching the fabric of my trousers. Her tears soaked through the fine wool, leaving cold, damp patches against my skin. The sheer force of her weeping echoed against the high vaulted ceilings of the grand dining room, bouncing off the abandoned crystal wine glasses and the spilled red wine that still stained the white tablecloth. I looked down at the top of her head, observing the trembling shoulders of the woman I had raised, protected and loved unconditionally for over 3 decades. I waited in the deafening silence for the familiar ache of paternal instinct to rise in my chest, the natural urge to kneel down, wrap my arms around her shivering frame, and promise her that everything would be all right. But there was absolutely nothing. The deep well of my forgiveness had run completely dry, scorched away by the horrific magnitude of her deceit. I looked down at my only daughter, and there was no warmth left in my eyes. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I only felt a profound, hollow, and absolute clarity. I slowly reached down my hands, moving with deliberate, unyielding purpose, and firmly peeled her fingers away from my legs. I took a slow, measured step backward, deliberately breaking the physical contact. She collapsed heavily onto the hardwood floor, looking up at me with severely smeared makeup and a face completely twisted in terror. She was still desperately waiting for her daddy to save her from the devastating consequences of her own horrific actions. "Derek manipulated your mind." I repeated her words slowly, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any comforting or sympathetic inflection. "You claim you were just a helpless, innocent victim caught tightly in his psychological web. You say you never actually wanted to hurt me, that you were somehow forced to agree with his monstrous plans." I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the crisp, sharply folded piece of paper I had carried with me for 3 agonizing days. I pulled it out and meticulously unfolded it under the bright, unforgiving glare of the crystal chandelier overhead. "Derek was the primary architect of the financial fraud," I stated calmly. "Derek forged the medical diagnostics. Derek brought the violent loan sharks into my home. But Derek did not do this." I dropped the small yellowed slip of paper onto the floor, letting it flutter down until it rested directly in front of her trembling knees. It was a standard computerized pawnshop receipt from a seedy, unregulated establishment located in the grimy industrial district downtown. Rachel stared down at the piece of paper, and her frantic, hysterical sobbing instantly died in her throat. The remaining color drained completely from her face for the second time tonight. She knew exactly what that receipt represented. "Your mother's diamond necklace," I stated, the heavy words falling like solid steel anvils into the absolute silence of the room. "The flawless diamond necklace I gave Diane on our 20th wedding anniversary. The necklace she explicitly asked me to ensure you inherited and cherished forever. You did not just stand silently by while Derek systematically stole my money and planned my institutionalization. You walked directly into my master bedroom. You forced open the hidden compartment inside Diane's antique vanity, and you stole her memory. You pawned her precious diamonds to buy your pathetic husband a few more weeks of time with his highly dangerous creditors. Derek did not manipulate you into desecrating your own mother's legacy. You made that terrible, selfish choice with your own two hands. Rachel opened her mouth to speak desperately, trying to form another fabricated excuse, another hollow apology, but the sheer crushing weight of the physical evidence silenced the lies before they could even materialize. She stared blankly at the receipt, her body shaking with a new, much deeper kind of terror. It was the paralyzing terror of absolute, undeniable exposure. "Love is not a blank check, Rachel," I told her, my voice echoing with a cold, unrelenting authority. "You foolishly believed my love for you was an infinite, inexhaustible resource that you could freely exploit without facing any real consequence. You assumed that simply because I am your father, I would eventually absorb your cruelty, your deceit, and your monstrous betrayal. You thought you could throw me away and still inherit the kingdom. But true love, the kind of love that builds a family and sustains a home, requires a solid foundation of fundamental respect. Without respect, love is nothing more than a convenient vulnerability for parasites to continuously feed upon. You stripped away every single ounce of respect you had for me the very moment you willingly signed those fraudulent commitment papers. You decided I was entirely disposable. You decided my life, my freedom, and my dignity were worth less than a Hawaiian vacation and the preservation of your shallow, fraudulent, luxurious lifestyle. I am not the confused, broken, frail old man you actively tried to lock away in a dark, chemical prison. I am the master engineer who built this entire estate from the ground up, and I am the man who is now finally reclaiming it." I slowly pulled back the cuff of my bespoke suit and checked the heavy gold watch secured to my left wrist. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the evening. "You have exactly 60 minutes, I commanded, delivering the final irrevocable sentence of her eviction. "You have 1 hour to go upstairs, pack whatever personal belongings will fit into the trunk of your vehicle, and walk out of my front door. You will leave the metallic keys to this house on the kitchen counter. You will not take any furniture. You will not take any expensive art. You will take your clothing, and you will leave immediately. If you are still standing inside these walls at 10 o'clock, I will call the police back to this property, and I will personally press felony charges for the deliberate theft of the diamond necklace. The choice is entirely yours." Rachel scrambled to her feet, realizing I was completely serious. She turned and sprinted up the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing chaotically through the quiet house. I stood completely motionless in the bright foyer, listening to the frantic, muffled sounds of wooden drawers being violently yanked open and heavy suitcases being hastily zipped shut. 50 minutes later, she descended the stairs, dragging 2 large canvas bags, her face entirely hidden by the dark shadows of her hair. She did not look back at me as she pulled open the heavy front door and ran out into the freezing snow. I stood on the porch, watching the red taillights of her car fade down the long driveway, disappearing into the dark winter night. I pulled my encrypted burner phone from my coat pocket and dialed a local number. I informed the professional locksmith who had been waiting in his van 2 blocks down the street that he could finally approach the property. It was time to change every single lock on the doors. The locksmith arrived within 20 minutes. I stood in the grand foyer and watched as he methodically removed the heavy brass cylinders from the front double doors, the side entrances, and the rear patio gates. The physical act of replacing the tumblers felt incredibly symbolic. With every click of his tools and every turn of his screwdriver, I was permanently sealing the structural breaches in my life. I paid the man in cash, thanked him for his prompt service on Christmas Eve, and locked the new deadbolt with a satisfying heavy thud. I listened to his van drive away, the engine hum fading, until the only sound left was the whistling wind. For the first time in 8 agonizing months, I was entirely alone inside my own home. I slowly walked through the quiet, empty rooms. The oppressive manufactured tension that had suffocated this estate was completely gone. The synthetic cheerfulness, the whispered conspiracies, and the constant lingering threat of my impending institutionalization had been entirely swept away by the freezing winter wind. I walked past the mahogany dining table where the spilled red wine had finally dried into a dark sticky stain on the white linen cloth. The shattered glass from Derek's mother still littered the rug, a glittering monument to their absolute failure. I walked past the secret cameras I had painstakingly hidden in the ceiling corners. The technological trap had served its ultimate purpose flawlessly, and now it could finally be dismantled. The deadly parasites had been permanently removed from the host. The betrayal committed by my own daughter still hurt. It was a deep, dull ache that would probably reside inside my chest for the rest of my remaining years. A father never truly wants to believe that his child is capable of such profound cruelty. We want to believe that the tiny hands we once held will never turn around and push us into the abyss. But as I stood in the center of my vast living room, looking at the pristine holiday decorations and the crackling embers in the grand stone fireplace, the overwhelming sense of absolute freedom completely eclipsed the pain. I had successfully secured my final years. I had aggressively defended the beautiful sanctuary I built with my own two bare hands. But I walked over to the antique crystal decanter resting on the polished oak side table. I poured myself a generous measure of vintage scotch, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the glass in my steady hand. The rich liquid burned pleasantly as I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the absolute, undeniable victory. I did not need to pretend my joints were stiff tonight. I did not need to manufacture a pathetic tremble in my fingers or a vacant, confused stare in my eyes. My mind was sharp, intensely focused, and entirely victorious. I carried the amber liquid over to the plush leather armchair, positioned directly in front of the warm fireplace, and slowly sat down, letting the deep warmth soak into my bones. Above the roaring fire hung a beautiful oil portrait of Diane. Her kind, intelligent eyes seemed to look down at me through the dancing shadows of the flames. I raised my crystal glass toward her painted image in a silent, solitary toast. I had kept my sacred promise. I had not allowed a pair of arrogant, greedy thieves to desecrate the legacy we had built together over 4 decades. I had ruthlessly protected our home, and most importantly, I had protected my dignity from utter destruction. The snow continued to fall heavily outside the large bay windows, blanketing the sweeping estate in a thick, pristine layer of silent white, permanently washing away the ugly rot of the recent past. The terrible storm was finally over. The master engineer remained standing perfectly tall, fully ready to enjoy the quiet, undisturbed peace of his newly secured, unshakable kingdom. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to commit abuse, exploit your hard work, or strip away your dignity. We are taught to sacrifice everything for our children, but true love sometimes means having the iron will to say no. When you allow disrespect to grow under the guise of family peace, you only breed monsters. Protect your legacy, guard your heart, and never forget that you owe nothing to those who view you as a disposable resource. Your final years are meant for peace, not for paying the debts of ungrateful people. Stand firm and take absolute control. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a deep betrayal from those you trusted the most? Let me know which city you are watching from. See you all next time.